It's the kind of thing that can get people into trouble often, is just like, I just need to survive. And a lot of times kids with ADHD get their hand caught in the cookie jar.
Oh, okay.
Because they're trying to not disappoint other people.
Right.
So because their ability to regulate themselves is so difficult.
That clip you just listened to was of me. My name's Zach Erickson, and this is The Shift Show. Today's episode is really cool for me personally because it is the episode where we talk all about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or what's more commonly known as ADHD, or for some people, ADD. The reason that I am so personally invested in this episode is because I'm actually in the seat of the guest. And Olga, who we heard in episode 2, so shout out to Olga Yakovleva, she is here interviewing me all about ADHD. This is an episode that came out quite a while ago, but it's one where I personally talk about my experience having ADHD. I found out that I had ADHD when I was 24. We talk about all sorts of things, including what it is, the different ways that it can appear both in childhood and adulthood. We can talk about specifically, the thing that I wanted to deliver was like, what is the lived experience of somebody with ADHD? Specifically to just sort of tell my story. It can help to hear other people's stories for those who have ADHD to really understand, like, this is not a you thing. This is, you're not a broken individual. There are lots of people who have gone through things like this, myself included. And so it's just a really valuable, hopefully meaningful window into the life of somebody with ADHD, as well as some of the lessons and insights that I personally have had that have helped me to work through it and to be as much of a productive adult as I can. So sit back and enjoy the episode.
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help.
For those of you who don't know, I think I've mentioned it on the show before.
Full disclosure.
Right, but I actually have ADHD, and so part of this is going to be a little bit of me sharing my journey, for lack of a better word, with ADHD, and then sort of understand, and then, we'll kind of cover a bunch of different things. So I guess as far as disclaimers go, I mean, we have the general disclaimer at the top of the show too, but in general, this is something to be aware of, that we're not, this is not a replacement for any sort of an assessment. It's in general, it's not good to just self-diagnose and treat that as the end-all situation, right? There are other ADHD can look like, or other things can look like ADHD. And so I think it's always important to get a thorough and proper assessment from somebody who is qualified to do that. Having said that, if this is the kind of thing that you feel like, wow, this is actually answering a lot of questions for me that I've never really, like, it's helping me put the pieces together, I think it's worthwhile to, follow up with whether it's your family doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist who does assessments and things like that. Those things can all be helpful as well. So, or
just consult.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, Olga, like, where do we start?
Yeah. So today I was hoping we can start with talking a little bit about what ADHD and ADD, what that diagnosis is. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about what are some of the symptoms, what are some of the common patterns, what are some of the common themes that we would notice with someone who might be qualified for a diagnosis. And I think it's important to use the word qualified as opposed to has a diagnosis. And you can speak more to that, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's part of even just sort of changing the language a little bit, because so I guess the first thing with ADHD, and you'd kind of use that ADD, ADHD.
There are 3 types.
Yes, exactly. Right. So I think the important thing is that it just is sort of we're all on the same page. The official terminology as of the DSM-5, which is the current diagnostic and statistical manual for mental disorders, everything, it's sort of a blanket term of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we'll get into later why the name sucks. Like anybody who actually knows a lot about ADHD will tell you the name is terrible because it doesn't actually describe what it is, and it's not actually even like there's no deficit in attention. It's more of a difficulty in shifting your attention, but and maintaining it. But I would say again, like you said, there are 3 types. ADD is a term that used to be used for the inattentive subtype of ADHD, which is I have, you know what, we could very briefly go through this. Just the list. Right? Just the list, exactly, right? And this is something that I sometimes will go through clients where they're like, I don't know if this makes sense for me. So for the inattentive subtype of ADHD, you have to have for children, it's 6, and we can talk a little bit about the difference between adults and children in a minute. But I think that for children, it's 6. For adults, it's 5 of the following. Number 1, often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. Number 2, often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. 3, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. 4, often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace. 5, often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. 6, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. I forget what number I was converting all of these letters to numbers. So anyways, next one is often loses things necessary for tasks or activities. For example, keys, wallet, pencils, schoolwork, etc. Next is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. For older adolescents or adults, this may include unrelated thoughts. And then the next one is the final one is often forgetful in daily activities. For example, doing chores, running errands. For older adolescents and adults, returning phone calls, paying bills, keeping appointments. Funny anecdote is that one of the things that I know I'm having a bad ADHD day when with the number of times that I go downstairs to get something, and by the time I got there, I have no idea when I'm down there. I have literally no clue why I'm downstairs. And so even just little things like that can be, but as even into the bigger things as far as like paying bills, returning phone calls, both in the smaller things and in the larger things. So in general, the inattention is the stereotype is the daydreamy sort of maybe scattered, like I think the scattered brained kind of thing can often be it. But again, easily distracted. I don't think that the word bored gets used enough when we talk about the inattentive subtype. And often like bored can also feed into things like being restless, which is more of the hyperactive subtype too. But so that's the first one, and that's what we used to call ADD.
Right.
I don't know, any questions or like?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I want to go back and talk a little bit more about why the name sucks. It sounds like you have very strong opinions about that. So was it one of those things where the label was created and it just got out there really quickly and really fast and got populated, and then it was too late to go back and actually clarify? It's not the deficit in attention, is the way that we navigate the shifts and flow of focus.
Right. Yeah. So even within some of these, like within some of the inattention pieces, right, where it's things like does not follow through on instructions. And the thing is, it's important too, is that the DSM is there for diagnosis. But once we know, and another thing as well is that that's different than what the actual lived experience of somebody with ADHD is. In a similar way to ADHD falls into a category of the DSM that we refer to as neurodevelopmental disorders. Yeah. Right. The other really big one that comes up for that is in the DSM is autism spectrum disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a completely, I'm not like, take the idea of symptoms out of it for a second and just talk about the idea of that this is just like with autism, that the brain has developed in a sort of way that results in a set of symptoms. And so this isn't the kind of thing that that necessarily, like, you have your brain, and one of the big things with ADHD too is that it needs to be present in childhood in order for you to qualify for it. You don't develop ADHD later in life. If you go into, if all of a sudden you're finding yourself distracted or feeling really restless or whatever, but this was not a thing when you were little, then often essentially the answer is, okay, well, it's probably something more like anxiety or depression or something like that.
Yeah.
I was going somewhere with that and I lost it.
Yeah. I have another question, something that
Yeah.
you said earlier, and it kind of alludes to the difference between getting a diagnosis versus a lived experience. You mentioned something along the lines of, on my bad ADHD day, does it mean that manifestation of symptoms and pattern of how it expresses itself kind of ebbs and flows depending on certain things, or is just something that comes up? Or in other words, how do you know you're having a bad day? What is a good ADHD day?
Sure, yeah. Well, and I could say like a really, really extreme examples, and I want to get to the hyperactive impulsive subtype in a second too. But but yeah, I would say that a very easy way for me to know is that, like, on a really bad day, there are certain things that contribute to, for me personally, my symptoms being more severe. So lack of sleep is a big one.
Okay.
If I have been, maybe less, if I haven't exercised or if I've been eating poorly, that can be a thing for sure. As well as obviously medication is a big one. Right. So if there's a day and the thing with the particular medication that I'm on, if I take it too late in the day, then I'm going to be up all night.
Right.
So for me, I will, like, every once in a while, some kinds of medications, and full disclaimer, consult somebody who actually deals with medication. I'm a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist or a doctor. So,
Ethical side note here.
Right. Yeah. But my personal experience has been that, like, on those days, it's like, oh yeah, I forgot this is what life used to be like all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's something that is, sort of something for me. Yeah.
Okay. So. And we'll chat a little bit more about coping strategies and meds later on. Let's get into hyperactive type.
The hyperactive impulsive subtype. So again, 6 or more of the following for children, 5 or more for adults, or older adolescents. So this is often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat. Second, often leaves their seat in situations when remaining seated is expected. For example, leaves a seat in the classroom, in the office or workplace. Again, that's sort of like restlessness, right? Often runs about or climbs in situations when it's inappropriate. In adolescents or adults, this may just be limited to feeling restless. The next, often unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly. A side note for me personally, sitting down to read a book for me is really hard. And it always has been. It's like the idea of sitting down and reading something. I have an app on my phone that I can put any kind of text into and it will read it to me. And that is the only way that I got through grad school. Right. Is to do that and, like, go for a walk or do the dishes or whatever. And that was something, and maybe sometimes just having that and then having the thing in front of me to follow along with, for some reason that was helpful too. So the next one is often on the go, acting as if driven by a motor. For example, is unable to be or uncomfortable being still for extended periods of time, as in restaurants or meetings. Maybe experienced by others as being restless or difficult to keep up with. The next one, often talks excessively. Next, often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed. Often has difficulty waiting his or her turn. And finally, often interrupts or intrudes on others, butting into conversations, games, activities, those kinds of things. So, And then finally, several of the symptoms need to be present before the age of 12. They need to be present in 2 or more settings. And that there is evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. So to just say, oh yeah, well, I get distracted sometimes. Well, does it negatively impact your life? Or is this something that just happens and you notice it? Like versus like, is it hard to hold down a job because it's hard to be on time, or it's hard to get the job done that you're expected to do because of these symptoms, right? So, and then finally, the symptoms do not occur exclusively through the course of schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. Yada, yada, yada. So
and you were saying earlier that getting a diagnosis is different from meeting the diagnostic criteria, and just because you don't meet diagnostic criteria doesn't mean that symptoms or symptomatic representation that you experience is not as impactful or significant.
Right. Yeah. So like, I think for a lot of people, maybe we like there's again, maybe, so one of the questions we talked about before we can just bring up now is sort of, if a child has it as a child and they're diagnosed with it, does that necessarily mean you are cured later in life?
Yeah.
And the answer, it's more of a question of, do you currently meet enough of those criteria on the list to qualify for a diagnosis? There, as you can imagine, there are lots of different things that could play into if those things are negatively impacting your life or not. A lot of people who are high functioning ADHD really learn some great skills and things like that to adapt or to compensate for the symptoms. The example that I use often is somebody who on the surface, you look at like from the outside, they look like they're very organized and on top of things, and they've got their planner with a million sticky notes and tabs and highlighted and all of this sort of stuff, and they've got this system to keep them in place. And then you say, okay, let's go a week without your planner, and they are a mess. Like, and not just because their life is a thing, but like they would forget to pick up their children after school, like something that you would think would be something that would be very straightforward and okay, but it's like, no, I literally referenced this list, otherwise I wouldn't even know what to do with myself.
And it's
during the
not
day.
because they don't care, it's because it's just the way that the attention is, or focus is being shifted between.
Right.
Yeah,
like a good example, if it was maybe somebody who's like a stay-at-home parent, and that was the case. And I know that for myself, when on days where I know like I am at home, I'm the one who's gonna have to go pick up my kids, consistently I'm like, okay, I've set an alarm to remind me to go, because if I don't, guaranteed my kids will be standing at that door after school and being like, where's dad? I don't know where because I ended up following down some rabbit hole of funny YouTube cat videos or something. Then suddenly I'm like, oh shoot, okay. So that's, I guess, my personal sort of experience. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Speaking of personal experience, can we talk a little bit more about getting a diagnosis? So you mentioned earlier that you were about 24 when
so I was
tell me a little bit what that was like, and maybe like extensively the whole like journey and then actual details of it, but from the personal note.
Maybe I'll even like start earlier, like when I was younger. Because with the lens of knowing that I had undiagnosed ADHD, I look back on some of the experiences that I had when I was younger and think, oh, this makes so much more sense now. Like I think that this is something that for a lot of people receiving an ADHD diagnosis can be very validating, because I know when I was a kid, it's funny, I actually saw like an early like home video when I was like probably 6 or something, and I was bouncing all over the wall. Like it was crazy to watch. And my parents were like, well, that's just what you were like. I don't know. That's just kids are kids. Right. Yeah. And I was the oldest, and they I think just assumed that's just what kids are like.
You just had a lot of energy.
Yeah, exactly. I would climb trees like crazy, which again, not there's like that's dysfunctional, but I just had a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And later on, when I remember, I have this very distinct memory where I would draw in class all the time. Always just drawing like cool little pictures or whatever. And my grade 4 teacher actually like would come by and confiscate my drawings and was like, you're not paying attention, you need to like, and I was like, and I remember a parent teacher interview where he like pulled out this folder that he had that was all of these drawings that he had confiscated, and was essentially like, you just need to apply yourself and you're not paying attention and whatever. I'm like, looking back, I'm like, that was actually a really good coping strategy to like sit and draw so that I could pay attention. But at the time I was just like, oh, I should pay attention more or whatever. And like thinking, you can imagine using the shift language, the kind of limiting beliefs that come up with that, right? Like there's something wrong with me or all sorts of stuff. I'm not good enough. So then fast forward to high school, I was always like a very intelligent, smart kid who got by on his smarts, but just didn't ever do anything really. Like as soon as I was there for recess, or classes that I was interested in. But then in high school, things like chemistry and physics and math that actually require, again, going back to
it got real.
Yeah, where it was like, again, that sustained mental effort thing that's in the inattention category. That was something where I was just like, nope, not doing it. And the number of times that I basically got to school and realized, oh crap, that chem assignment was due. Just the number of times that I was trying to figure out how to do and just like writing down whatever I could, or like finding a friend who was like, sort of like, anyways, I'm sorry, Mr. Chan, a chemistry teacher, if you knew this, but
hello,
if you ever hear this, but hello. And also I'm sorry, I ended up never using chemistry, but, thank you to my friends who lended me their work. Anyways, I do not condone that kind of behavior, but it's the kind of thing also that is a coping strategy, right?
It's an adaptive mechanism.
Yeah.
Sure.
And like morally, it's not great. Right. And I think that it's, but I think that, and it's the kind of thing that can get people into trouble often is just like, I just need to survive. And a lot of times kids with ADHD get their hand caught in the cookie jar.
Oh, okay.
Because they're trying to not disappoint other people.
Right.
So because their ability to regulate themselves is so difficult. So anyways, so then going into...
So just a quick side note, a limiting belief would be I am a disappointment.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not understood alongside that too, right?
Yeah.
So then fast forward to university, I'm doing amazing in the classes that I find interesting. I am bombing in the classes that I don't like. And that's usually for me when I'm talking to new clients, that's always something like, okay, well, if it was something interesting to you, it's like, oh yeah, it was like straight A's. And like, what about something that was more boring? It was like, oh, I don't know, I passed. Right? And it can be that wide of a difference. So
we're looking for that drastic contrast.
If it's something that's interesting, then absolutely I can do it. In fact, I might even throw myself into it more than most people would. But if it's not, and if it's, heaven forbid, it's boring. I had a social studies teacher once. He just called me a clock watcher, which I absolutely was. But to be fair, he was super dry and boring. And so, so that was something that, like, this isn't just like a level of boredom, like this is like full, like leaning back, slouching, like, I can't even do that. Like that's what boredom feels like for me personally sometimes. So I get this. So I went. So
we're talking about this like visceral reaction on a physical level.
That some people will even just use the word dread. Like the boredom and dread sort of go hand in hand. Sometimes. So
which would make sense that you would do whatever it takes to avoid that, because it doesn't sound like it's a fun place to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not only that, but then you pair that with potentially, that experience going over and over and over again, that could then lead to even just like anxiety, right? There's like anxiety for doing that too, because it's going to be so unpleasant and things like that. So, So anyway, so then going into I'm in a class that is essentially just a bunch of different mental disorders. I can't remember. I think it was psychopathology. And I had taken this class from somebody and I had taken several classes with her, and she was assigning presentations to give for everybody. And I think by this time she was like, I got this.
Something's happening.
Yeah.
There.
So she assigned me and my group to do ADHD, and as I was reading everything, I was just like, oh my gosh, this fits my whole life, right? Like this describes my past week and the past month of my life, and like literally everything. And so I, at that point, essentially, I gave the presentation and then went on, and I went to an on-campus doctor, who I basically said, this is what I think is going on. Here's all of the reasons. They referred me to a psychiatrist who actually would come to the campus, who would come on campus I want to say like once every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
He was specifically like, he specialized in things like ADHD.
Right.
And so I met with him. He gave me one of them was just like a self-report,
Okay.
like symptom checklist
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. And the other one he actually sent me to, and I wish that I knew what test they were using. I didn't know back. I feel like now I would like remember, but it was specifically like a computerized like skill assessment for
Mm-hmm.
impulsivity and things like that, where it was essentially like, here's these characters on the screen. When it's this character, click the thing. When it's not, don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I just bombed the test apparently,
Yeah.
which is consistent with ADHD. So I did that, and then we just sort of did some medications, and I tried a few different medications until I found a medication that worked for me and a dosage that worked for me, at which point he just said, okay, well, you can just follow up with your family doctor from now on. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just keep using this. And then if there's any real problems, then if you feel like you need to come back, you can. So yeah, so that was sort of
Yeah.
the, mm-hmm.
So a lot of feedback that I hear from clients and just in general in regards to receiving a diagnosis of any sort of condition or illness, disorder, it's either this believe there's something wrong with me sinks even deeper and
Mm-hmm.
cements even harder into your core belief system, where you go, okay, like I told you there's something wrong with me, here's proof. Or there's this overwhelming relief, like finally things make sense.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like for you?
For me, well, again, going back to like some of those experiences, like the folder, like my art portfolio of my grade 4 teacher, right? Like
Yeah.
for me, I look back now and I'm like, oh, that makes way more sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
he basically like pulled this folder out and like shamed me to my parents,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm like, well, that actually was a really positive coping strategy for doing that.
Yeah.
And like a lot of different things throughout my life, I just look at that and think, yeah, you know what? This actually makes so much sense. And one of the things with ADHD is that there are so much research out there on what is helpful and what are, that it almost felt like I explained to my wife at one point, I was like, this is kind of like taking all of what at the time felt like all of the character flaws that I didn't like about myself the most. And it was like going and buying a book on ADHD was like buying a manual on how to deal with all of that kind of stuff, while at the same time saying, this is not a character flaw. This is actually just what your brain is like.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Some unique features that are specific
Mm-hmm.
to you. Okay.
Well, and it also helped me sort of appreciate the fact that there are some real positive
Mm-hmm.
characteristics to ADHD. I'm going to pull up a quick list in this. A great book is called Delivered from Distraction. It's by Edward Hallowell and John Ratey. And it's a good book that kind of covers all sorts of things, but it has a list of positive, what they would say like advantageous characteristics of ADHD that are actually sort of borne out in sort of clinical impressions as well as some of the research as well. So advantageous characteristics are things, many creative talents, usually underdeveloped until the diagnosis is made. So some creativity there. Original, out-of-the-box thinking, tendency toward an unusual way of looking at life, a zany sense of humor, an unpredictable approach to anything and everything. Remarkable persistence and resilience, if not stubbornness, warm-hearted and generous behavior, and highly intuitive style. So they're very, again, like there's a lot of that sort of on the negative side, a lot of those impulse, like a lot of the characteristics
Mm-hmm.
and the symptoms, there can be downsides, but there's also a positive side to it too, right? So somebody who is impulsive, for example, you could say is spontaneous,
Mm-hmm.
right? Somebody who is inattentive or easily distracted tends to see the big picture, right? Tends to see lots of different angles of the same situation, right? And so there's I think that appreciating that was also something that was helpful for me.
Yeah.
So,
which going forward can make someone a big asset in a specific work environment as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think another thing that was big for me at the time was, for both me and my wife, was to understand that some of the things that were getting in the way of our relationship were actually just something that like we both sort of had this realization of, oh, wait a minute, this is this is a thing that is never going to go away. We can learn how to deal with it and learn how to compensate for it. But it's not something like, it's not a fact that, well, you asked me 5 times to do this thing and I still haven't done it and I forgot. Doesn't mean I don't care. It just means I forgot and I got distracted. And it's not that I don't care about her. It's not like all that kind of stuff, right? It was literally just, I'm just having a day. It's just the way my brain works. So.
Right. Yeah, that also reminded me of one of the common myths that go along with the ADHD and diagnosis that connects to that is that people with ADHD are either lazy or stupid, or it's a reflection of intelligence. So it's important to debunk that and state that it's not a learning disability. It's not something that's reflective of intelligence. In fact, individuals who do have or meet the criteria for ADHD statistically score higher on intelligence scores, and which likely related to the ability to focus on specific tasks that are stimulating for them.
Yeah, on average, right? Yeah, for sure. And I think that, again, like somebody who is high functioning with ADHD, you may never even know, right? You may never realize that that's what's going on. And so absolutely, yeah. And I think that for me, whenever I hear the word lazy, I'm just the more as soon as I understood what ADHD was, the number of times I've been called lazy in my life, it was actually pretty high, right? Because I no longer think that word is useful at all, because what you're talking about is a difficulty with motivation, right? And that's part of ADHD for a lot of it as well, is that something is not stimulating or exciting enough to hold my attention, therefore it's hard for me to feel motivated to do it. And then people just come into that and say, oh, well, you're just lazy. It's like, well, no, like there's lots of pieces here, and maybe sure, if you want to throw a word that's just laced with all sorts of negative judgment, sure, I guess, but it's not helpful, it's not descriptive. It's a word that is trying to use shame to motivate somebody,
which is never effective,
which just doesn't work, right? So yeah, so I don't know, like, does that
completely. So again, we have the tandem of there's something wrong with me, I'm not understood happening.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So. You briefly alluded to some of those secondary symptoms, which I was hoping we can dig a little bit deeper into. So you mentioned when we talking about being bored and something that accumulates into dread, and then it becomes an anxiety. Would that anxiety be one of those secondary symptoms?
Yeah, well, yeah, like I sometimes refer to them as like secondary symptoms, or I guess you could call them like co-morbid disorders, right? Is like this psychological sort of term for it as well. But just like these secondary things that come up more as a result of somebody having ADHD, and especially untreated ADHD. So one of the interesting statistics, and I wish I would have looked this number up beforehand, but one of the big things for children with ADHD is that on average they receive, I want to say, it can be as high as 10 times as much negative feedback from authority figures in their life, right? So things like, hey, what are you doing? Get down from there. Shouldn't you be cleaning your room? Shouldn't you be doing your homework? Shouldn't, just all sorts of turn around, stop talking to your neighbor. Yeah, all of that, right? And over time, depending on the personality of the child, depending on if there are also positive authority figures in their life that are like affirming and supportive, there can be a real influence on how, you can deal with that in different ways. Some kids, they're just like, yeah, nope, just like, I'm going to internalize all of it, and I'm an idiot, and I'm stupid, and I'm lazy, and I'm not good enough, and I'm incapable, and like pile that on, right? And I'm just going to take all of that on and just think there's something wrong with me. I'm just and there's some real like deep depression that can come from that, and like low self-esteem, anxiety again, right? And
that then learned helplessness that we talked about, where nothing is ever working out, so might as well not even try.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, you have other kids who basically they get all of that same negative feedback, and instead, in more of like a self-protective sort of way, they kind of just throw their hands out and just say, back off, leave me alone. I don't want to hear it anymore. Which is one of the prevailing theories of like the origin of something like oppositional defiant disorder.
Oh, okay.
Which is a diagnosis in children that basically just becomes this like anybody who's in authority, screw them, don't care. Like I don't like you tell me to do something, I'm going to do the opposite because I'm tired of hearing this.
So we're talking about those rebellious behaviors and patterns
coming from a place of I'm having a heart like again like that I'm not understood. Those kinds of things, right? Where there's this pushback, and if that's not treated, if that's the intervention isn't in place there, and that can often even spiral into something like conduct disorder, which is in adults, or just sort of difficulties with the law, difficulties with employment, difficulties in relationships, which is why it's so important to, and I know maybe this even feeds into some of the what we were talking about before of like the hesitation with diagnosis.
Oh, okay.
Right. And why it's important. Like if these symptoms are, if the ADHD in a child is there, treatment is important, and it's important to deal with those and not just treat them as character flaws, but to treat them as like, no, this, like if your child had autism, you would do interventions that would help the child's developing brain to go in the right direction instead of in a negative direction. And in a similar way, you want to treat ADHD in a child as something of like, okay, well, we want to encourage pro-social behavior is what we call it, right? Like, help develop positive relationships, help develop positive self-image, learn skills, all those kinds of things. So,
yeah. Okay, so those would be some of those secondary symptoms that we're going to look out for and pay attention to, because they can be small little windows into what might be that underlying issue and concern too.
And the underlying issue in some of those, not all, but in some of those situations is ADHD. And I think it's important to at least consider, is that a possibility? So.
Yeah. So you mentioned medication briefly. So I wanted to ask, what is your experience with medication, and in general, kind of like your opinion on that, and also kids versus adults realm with that line of treatment?
Yeah. So I don't have a ton of experience with medication. Like I'll just talk about my personal experience and also what the research says for adults. I don't necessarily have as much experience with children. And so especially like the long-term effects of ADHD medication, I think that sometimes there's some scary, sort of ideas that people have about it, but it's also worth considering, okay, well, don't compare that to just like a normal functioning kid. You have to compare it to the child as they are now. And sometimes you may be like, there's going to be side effects, but are they worse than what your symptoms are already, right? So that's children, and again, like sort of disclaimer, see your doctor, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But for my personal experience, I actually, my wife has told me that it saved our marriage. I personally found it to be, I once explained it to somebody as it felt like being able to take maturity in pill form, that I was able to actually be an adult, and adulting is something I can actually do now. Whereas beforehand I really couldn't. It was hard for me to just remember to pay bills and things just because of just sort of my difficulty with being organized. I had an ADHD coach for a year when I was doing my master's thesis in neuroscience. And she told me, and I stole this from her and I use it all the time with clients, is pills don't teach skills.
Yeah.
Right? So the medication, the research shows that the best outcomes come from people who come from treatment that is both behavioral interventions, like, being organized, having a planner, all sorts of other things we can talk about, as well as medication. Like a combined approach is what brings that up. And the way that I describe it is that the medication takes the edge off the symptoms enough that you can actually implement the skills that you know you should be doing. But without the medication, for me at least, it feels like without the medication, sometimes I'm literally sitting there on my phone scrolling on Facebook or something, and I'm like, wow, I really should get up and do that thing that I told my wife I was going to do, but I'm not doing it for some reason. That way, like with medication, I actually, when I have that thought, I'm like, yep, you're right, I should, and I get up and I do it.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the for me, I personally feel like it has been helpful, but it's not for everybody either. And I think that everybody needs to kind of figure out what is the right solution for them. I think that a lot of people, again, going on with that, like there's something wrong with me or I am weak or something. I think that sometimes people just sort of discount the idea of using medication because that somehow is going to be, I don't know, like that it's just something that means they're weak or something like that, right? Or I just want to be able to do it without medication. The metaphor that I often use is just imagine that there was a kid who sat at the back of the class and just was like, no, like I can't see the board, but I don't give me those stupid glasses. I don't want those glasses. I want to be able to do them without glasses. And it's like, okay, sure. Like you can sit at the back of the room and squint your eyes and, like try. And I'm not saying that and if that works, that's fine. Right. But if you have like moved to the front of the room and you're squinting your eyes and you're doing everything that you can, and you still feel like I still can't read this stupid board, then put some glasses on. That's what the medication is that it's like wearing glasses and being able to see that. So
it literally makes things a little bit more clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It gives me like a mental sharpness that I don't have otherwise.
Right.
So.
Okay. And essentially going to take away from that, listen to your body, listen to what your needs are, listen to manifestation of your own symptoms or anything else that can be associated with that, and really use any other tools that are available at the disposal. Medication would be one of them to tailor to the uniqueness of your experience.
Yeah. Just in the same way that you would view glasses, or sometimes as well, I'll kind of tell people, imagine that you needed a wheelchair and then sort of somebody said, well, I mean, like you could take the stairs without it. It's like, or I guess you could be able to take the stairs. It's like, well, I mean, sure, you could drag your body up the stairs. If you were in a wheelchair, sure, you could drag your body up the stairs, but why? You could get in a wheelchair and you could take the wheelchair ramp, and it's, I think that shedding that shame of that I think is really an important step for regardless of if you have medication or not, right? So
as we were talking about kids versus adults and medication use, another thing that popped to mind that is one of the common misconceptions about ADHD is that it's a result of bad parenting. So it's something that gets a lot of parents to experience that the parental guilt that's associated with that. So we really want to clarify that that's because it's neurodevelopmental, the neurological disorder. It's not something that's a result of poor discipline or someone dropping a ball on the parenting side.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You also mentioned when we're talking about the judgment piece there's a lot of stigma and fear and judgment and shame that's associated with ADHD and kind of symptomatic representation of that, which shows itself not only in general public but in school systems too. So I don't know if that's something that you came across, or it's something that you have a
I feel it's interesting because I think I in sort of sharing my personal experience with that, I don't want to discount the fact that other people do struggle with this, because I think that a lot of people do. I think that maybe I'm just too stubborn or too just like that I know that for myself, as soon as I had that diagnosis, for me, it was very, I almost want to say empowering in a sense, where I think knowing myself, and again, I think it's different with children too, right? Like I think that a lot of hesitation for parents when their child has ADHD is that there is a hesitation of don't give my kid a label, right? Because then they're going to be labeled as the bad kid in class or whatever. And I think that genuinely that is something that probably does happen in some cases, right? In fact, potentially in a lot of cases. And I think that it is still important. I guess the question in the school system that I would ask is, are these symptoms, again, are they getting in the way of your child being able to function? And do they need additional supports, right, in school in order to be able to do it, in order to be able to function? And often if receiving a diagnosis is going to help them get the support that they need
and extract the full value out of that learning experience to the maximum of its capacity.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with the school system where, you have to get an assessment and then they're going to go and apply for funding in order to be able to have somebody who's going to sit down with the child one-on-one or something like that. That's something that is important, and maybe there is some stigma around that, but don't let that stigma get in the way of getting your child the support that they need, because the alternative is, I think that some parents, they're like, you know what, we'll just deal with this at home. And if you feel like you can do that and it's working, then great. But if you feel like that we need support from the school end, that is sort of the process that's in place to do that. Right. And don't let your child go just struggle because they don't have that yet, if that makes sense. And again, every situation is different, but I would just say that it's at least worth considering, maybe to soften my own language a little bit, right? I would say trust your own gut, right, and do what you feel is best for you and your child. But yeah, I think it is worth considering. Am I letting the potential shame of this and stigma of having ADHD for my child, is that something that I'm letting get in the way of what's best for them?
Yeah, so for sure. And in terms of adult presentation of ADHD, and specifically, what has your experience been, and in general, your opinion on how it impacts relationships, whether we're talking romantic relationship, whether we're talking employment relationships, what would be some of the common themes and patterns that we notice there? So
I think, again, maybe even splitting it into the inattentive versus the hyperactive impulsive, right? I think from the inattentive subtype, in a romantic relationship, the forgetfulness, the distractibility, difficulty being present, all of those kinds of things can have a negative impact on the relationship, as far as just feeling like, oh, well, you just don't care, or you forgot my birthday, or you forgot my anniversary, or whatever it is, right? How could you, right? Pro tip for anybody out there with ADHD, sit down and literally write down every single birthday, whatever, put it as an alarm in your phone, and have a reminder 3 days before come up to say, by the way, in 3 days it's your anniversary, or a week or a month or whatever you want to do, right? I personally, I refer to as just an externalized brain. Anything that you will be sad if you forget, there should be a digital reminder, an alarm that goes off, whatever it is. For me, that's a big thing, is that there's constantly those kinds of things. So the forgetfulness piece, I think, is one, as well as even just chore balance, right? Workload at home can be a thing, as well. And, oh, well, it's your turn to do the dishes and you didn't do them, right? The motivation side again, right? So that's something that's potentially there. The hyperactive impulsive subtype symptoms are also big things too. There's a big impulsivity also shows up as emotional impulsivity. So almost and also people with ADHD generally tend to have a lower, what we call a frustration tolerance. Okay. Right. So when you start to feel overwhelmed, I know even for myself, if I start to feel overwhelmed, I kind of just I want to say sometimes just explode a little bit, right? Just leave me alone, or something, or just, and very defensive and reactive. Yeah. And those emotional explosions, for lack of a better word. I don't think I ever
remember you doing that.
Right? But again, I usually, when I'm at work, I am medicated and I'm in the middle of the day and I'm doing pretty well, right? Yeah. But put me around a bunch of little kids who are fighting and, whatever, and maybe I've skipped my medication for the day on accident. I try not to, but it happens, right? That kind of thing can happen, especially, and this is another thing too, is that often, kind of going back to the limiting beliefs, we often can be hypersensitive to criticism. Okay. And so especially if it's hitting on one of those limiting beliefs already. And so I think that's something that can be a factor. And if we don't know that going into the relationship, for me and my wife now, when that kind of thing happens, my wife and I have gotten very good at, and my wife has some anxiety as well. And so like her and I, we're in a place now where it's like, okay, well, if we see that in each other, we don't treat it as like, that was this great injustice or like, how dare you or things like that. It's like, okay, you're having a bad day.
Yeah.
And that's okay. You're allowed to have a bad day. Here's the boundary again. Like, we're on the same team, but let's like rein it in and just sort of gently reminding each other or assertively doing that, right? But having that sort of understanding on why that's happening. This isn't like, oh, well, you're just a jerk. It's no, you're overwhelmed. And I think that's part of what happens with that.
Yeah, so I'm extracting the point of acceptance. This is something that I have and something that will be with me. So I'll just have to adapt and learn to live with it and still extract the full value of my fulfillment from life and day-to-day living.
And some days you just have to ride that wave.
Exactly.
Right? And that's okay. And that's frankly, it's the only way that I have found to deal with it. Like, and yes, to go and like revisit those limiting beliefs when they come up and to say, okay, why, like, and dealing with those limiting beliefs can help with how reactive or how sensitive you can be to some of that like criticism. But it's, I don't know, like I still have my days. They're much less often than they used to be, but it still happens from time to time.
And I think we're slowly merging into the realm of coping strategies and talking a little bit about some of the tools that can be used and applied. So from what I've gathered so far, you talked a little bit about that alarm system around agenda setting. So really having those like, tangible tools in place that really, again, tailor to the uniqueness of your symptomatic presentation or experience, and really that work for you, that you found efficient throughout the years of application. Another thing that came to mind as we were talking about your drawing collection, there's I don't know if you've read it, there's like newfound research that doodling in adults, like, you know, how sometimes like it would have been frowned upon in meetings where like someone would doodle and like, you're not paying attention, what's happening, you're not even here. And right now people are actually encouraged to doodle in meetings and presentations, workshops, etc., because that is something that allows them to stay present and in the moment and really connect to the information flow that's happening outside them. So it's just something that popped into my mind. I was thinking, so doodling is good.
Yeah. Well,
what are some of the other strategies?
So I think to go back to the organizational thing for a second, right? There are two things. I think one thing that I would say is find a system that works for you. And I personally have found that just, you know, the idea of like an agenda or a planner, or I would say the one thing is that have one place that you do it, and have it all there. At most, have one place digitally and one place physically, like a notebook or something. That, because I think a lot of times what happens is we got like, random papers everywhere, and it just
gazillion of Post-it notes.
So that can become a problem. I personally find that there are two different things. The more like loose version of it is something called bullet journaling, which is a big thing. I would say for people with ADHD, beware, don't get sucked into the artsy side of bullet journaling. That's like, unless you find that something that's really fulfilling, but I think that it's something tempting. It's something of like that could really suck you in as far as like, oh, well, I'm going to spend 3 hours drawing my calendar for the month. If that's something you want to do and that's fulfilling, and that's great.
Could be that self-care piece too.
Yeah, right. But don't let that get in the way of the usefulness of it. So bullet journaling is one thing you can Google, you can look up on YouTube. There's lots of great stuff. And then for more of like the high functioning like there's a great book out there called Getting Things Done. I think it's by David Allen. And it is something that is essentially designed for like CEOs and very people who are so busy that they will always have an overwhelming to-do list, that there will always be more things to get done than time to do it. And so that is a book out there that there's an audiobook. So for ADHD people, there's an audiobook in there you can get, and it's really helpful too. But it's a system that I think regardless of what your system is, just take pieces of all of these different things as you're looking for them and just adapt to what works for you.
Yeah.
So that's that. And then what was the other one that
we're talking about alarm. So far I'm hearing those pieces of having something that's in place that's consistent and stable.
A funny anecdote too is that I know that for myself, being on time for work has always been a little bit of a challenge for me. And like I was always like late for class, and it's just I don't know, it's one of the symptoms that often is there. And so one of the alarms that I have is that for days that I have to be here, like when it's first thing in the morning, I sometimes have clients as early as 9 o'clock, but I just drop my kids off at school and then I come straight here. But for the days that I start at 1 o'clock, I have an alarm that starts going off at 11:30, and I don't turn it off completely until I'm in my car driving to work. And I will snooze the alarm for like the hour before I leave, because I know for myself, I'm like, yep, okay, I need to start getting ready, and I will snooze it. And I can't tell you the number of times that like I've already snoozed it twice, and all of a sudden I'm like scrolling through my phone for something, and the alarm goes off again. I'm like, shoot, yep, I should be getting ready.
That's where I need to be.
Yeah, and so that's the little tricks that you find for yourself, I think are really valuable and important too. So
I think at one point in our conversations, the time management technique, I think it was called Pomodoro technique or something along those lines.
Pomodoro technique is a big one.
Is that something that can be helpful in terms of zoning out from the task that you are hyper-focused in? Not you particularly, but just in general.
Absolutely. No, like I would say timers in general are really helpful as far as setting a timer. If you have something that you're not really feeling that motivated by, I actually learned this originally. I mean, you can look up Pomodoro technique, and this is especially helpful if you have like a desk job or you are writing papers or something. But my own mother actually taught me this early on, and I didn't even like, it wasn't ever tied to ADHD, but one of the things that she would always do is like, okay, well, you have a chore to do. I'm going to set a timer and see if you can beat the timer.
Ooh.
Right. And so like,
challenge.
Right. And so it was like, okay, you need to clean the kitchen, but, we're going to set like a 15-minute timer.
Yeah.
Right. And like, you'd be amazed if you try and beat the timer, how fast you can do something.
All the parents are now taking like diligent notes.
and like basically what you've done is you've turned, anytime you take an activity or some sort of a task and you turn it into a game, right? Like that is something that I think that even for adults, we think like, oh, well, that's silly. Why would I do that? Like that, like I'm too cool. I'm an adult now or whatever. Right. Too bad. I'm a kid at heart. And I think that having fun and turning something into a game is something that it's going to make it more enticing, and therefore you're going to be more motivated, and it's going to be more rewarding, and it's going to be easier to get it done.
Yeah.
So
for sure. Any other tools or strategies that would be helpful, or there's something that comes to mind that would be?
Yeah, I think again there are so many other things, honestly. So I guess one thing I'm sort of referencing this book. One thing I think that is really important as well, and when I think about my own life and why I have been successful in getting
things done,
and just and sort of overcoming ADHD. Honestly, it's funny because in this book of Delivered from Distraction, they have an entire chapter that's just like top tips. Okay. The very first one is marry the right person. Aww. Someone who loves you for who you are. And I think like someone who is accepting, but also somebody who, at least for me, I think surrounding the fact that my wife loves and accepts me for who I am, and also that she is very detail oriented, right? Like she is somebody who I'm like, oh shoot, okay, like when are the bills supposed to be paid? When's this, that? And she's like, don't even worry about it. I got it all taken care of. Like this. And like she's very conscientious, whereas I just would drop the ball a million times if I did that, right? And so I think part of it is having people in your life who are supportive, and who are a good match for you, I think is really, really important too. Yeah. So, and I guess the other thing that I would say as far as other sort of tips or strategies, I think, and this is less about actually having, like dealing with the symptoms, but more of just like, don't take yourself too seriously, right? That on a bad day, if you're having an ADHD kind of day, you're allowed to do that. And I think that I think that there is a lot of room for the self-compassionate eye roll of just like, oh, yeah, okay, of course that happened. Sure, whatever, let's keep going. Like, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to let it get in my way. a little, and just not taking yourself too seriously.
Yeah.
And when those kinds of things happen, which they absolutely will, then I once forgot to withdraw from a course that I had thought I'd withdrawn from, and it cost me like $1,000 just because, as a poor student, I just didn't get any tuition back when I thought I was going to. And I was just like, okay, well, there's the ADHD tax there. Like, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to dwell on it. There's nothing I can do. Just move on.
Yeah. So in addition to marrying the right person who accepts you for who you are, also generating that self-acceptance and coming to terms with the thing through that channel as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So
great.
So yeah.
That's awesome. And in terms of resources, some of the things that people can reach out to. So do you want to mention the title of the book again?
Yeah. So this one is called Delivered from Distraction: Getting the Most Out of Life with Attention Deficit Disorder. This is, at least the version that I have, is like an updated version on it, I think. But yeah, there's lots of, it's pretty straightforward. I like the book too, because it's like the very front of the book is, it's got an entire section that's basically like, if you can't read the whole book, here is like a summary of the whole book in 20 pages. So that's perfect for somebody with ADHD.
Yeah.
So
any other podcasts, any other articles, any other sources of material that would be helpful for people?
I would say maybe one of the things that's really great out there as well, there's some great YouTube videos out there. There is a great YouTube channel called How to ADHD. And I think her name is Jessica something. I can't remember now. Sorry, Jessica, if you're listening. But she has a great YouTube channel out there, and she's very sort of upbeat and bubbly and just easy to watch. And she has lots of really great researched videos as well. So yeah, I would say that's definitely a resource. And again, I think just sort of find those things that work for you, and I think that we can kind of, if you have any questions about specific areas that you want us to cover more in future episodes, let us know, and we can definitely do that as well. So
for sure. Great. Thank you so much, Zach, for answering all of the questions that we had.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear, so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by ShiftPsych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.